Hello and welcome to the January 23rd edition of Ukraine Without Hype. This is episode 100. We've made it through 100 episodes of this, starting out as a very niche podcast for a country nobody cared about to where we are now. I don't know what that is.
We're still an incredibly niche podcast for a country most people do not care about, yes.
But this is also our New Year's episode. During our first episode of January was our history episode because I was delaying having episode 100 be a more banner one. So this episode we're going to talk about what happened in 2024 and what we will predict happening in 2025. This will not have too many facts and figures, mostly conversational. What was going on in the year? What will happen in the year? So started us off nice and light. Romeo, how you doing? What's up? Reflections on the year.
Oh, ups and downs. To be honest, my life is pretty much defined by the war. There's not much outside of that. I got a new kitten. Picked up a new kitten out of slightly tragic circumstances. A very cute kitten. It belonged to a friend's father who passed away rather unexpectedly. We took the kitten in, and honestly, that was the biggest personal change in my life. Otherwise, the news is pretty all-encompassing, especially when that is your job and your hobby and your interests. I would recommend having a diversified set of interests, but some people's brains work in mysterious ways.
Yeah, it wasn't a great year for me. I got the COVID at the very end of 2023, and that kind of wiped me out for most of 2024, to be honest. So unfortunately, I was not able to go into the field much because of that. Now that I've kind of worked my way back into being a functioning human being, I intend to do that again in 2025. I need to leave Kiev a bit more than I already do. I have some plans in place for that already. Other than that, yeah, the war is the war. It's hard to define anything about your personal or professional life outside of the context of the war. It is who I am now, as it is for most other people. Not healthy. I would like to, in 2025, find some ways to, deal with that, but we'll have to figure that out as time goes on. Started going back to the gym after like 3 months, so that's one improvement there.
Hooray.
So,
also, therapy is a thing.
Yes, in theory.
I recently went to a psychological resilience for Ukrainian journalists panel hosted by the 2402 Foundation in Kiev. Oh, they had a speaker there, an associate professor, I believe, of psychology from Columbia. And she apparently ran a few surveys amongst Ukrainian journalists while she was in the country. And it turns out Ukrainian journalists are, according to the surveys she's held, at least, the most depressed, the most burnt out, the least optimistic, the least hopeful, and the least with positive beliefs about their job prospects.
Well, you see, Romeo, I don't deserve help because, why one should go to therapy would be one condition of why I'm not in therapy is my stilted belief that because other people have it worse, I do not deserve to be made better. I don't believe I'm alone in that feeling, though. It is pretty natural, I think. But moving on from the physical and mental well-being of journalists in Ukraine and the lack thereof. Yeah. We can go on to the state of the podcast. What's the health of the podcast going on? I can say numbers wise, basically what happened was with the beginning of the Israel-Gaza war, pretty much everything in Ukraine, journalism wise, took a hit. The world only has room to pay attention to one story at a time, and that was no longer us, leading to a lot of struggling across the journalistic sector in the country. For us, however, that did happen. We saw a similar decline. So that would have been a little over a year ago. October of 2023 was when that began. Though that did stem a bit, and we did begin to stabilize and crawl out of the bleeding by about the middle of 2024. Though our output-wise, I think we've made an improvement. We put out more this year. We definitely were more regular throughout the year than we had been in the past, though that did take a decline in November and December, largely because of my leaving the country to America and some of the scheduling problems because of that. And quality-wise, I think our quality has consistently gone up. So I think rating our performance for this year, I'm pretty happy with our output. I think we did some good episodes. The episode that got the most views actually was covering when Ukraine invaded Russia and began the occupation of the Kursk Oblast. I think it's quite obvious why that became our biggest episode. It was the biggest story of the year from a headline grabbing perspective. And also on YouTube, we got most of our YouTube videos get maybe, a couple dozen views. We don't really promote our YouTube very much. We don't do anything special with it. But for whatever reason, the algorithm grabbed on to that episode on YouTube. I don't know. We did a few more special interest topics. I was really happy with our episodes on disinformation and also JD Vance and his connection to the far right. I think that's the one I'm happiest with, is the JD Vance episode. We got a lot more theoretical, got a lot more abstract than we usually do. And that's one thing that I would like to do in 2025 is do more like audio essay type things, more so than only our news updates. Our news updates are bread and butter. Definitely not going to stop doing that. Will continue to be the majority of our output. I would like to get a bit more creative.
Yeah, I agree, especially with what we're seeing, the kind of vortex, I don't know if you could call it, of the global far right descending pretty uniformly everywhere. And especially, obviously, because the far right is one of those forces opposing Ukraine. This has a very tangible and direct impact on us here in Kyiv. And I think it is critically important to continue to stress how important anti-fascism and how important resisting this authoritarian creep, especially with Donald Trump's second term now as president of the United States, how all of this is linked and how vitally important it is for people to understand this, so they understand that these conflicts that we're going through, they are not isolated. They are not just lone wolf incidents that are disconnected from anything else. No, all of these things are connected. Russia invading us is connected to the rise of the global far right, the Chinese revanchism against Taiwan, or more active revanchism against Taiwan, the suppression of dissent in Hong Kong, the failure of the pro-democracy movements in Central Asia. All of this is connected, and it's connected to the same people, the people that are causing all of these problems. They are largely friends, or at least compatriots. They know each other. They work together. They go to each other's conferences. I think it is vitally important to make sure that this fact is communicated over and over, because especially in the West, there seems to be this trend of growing isolationism, especially with the domestic situation that the United States is now facing, that is just counterproductive. You cannot have effective resistance if you shut yourself down to all of the other factors, global factors that are affecting the situation we now find ourselves in. We've always been rather vocal about our political positions here on Ukraine Without Hype. We are a left-wing podcast. We very much approach things from a liberal and progressive viewpoint, and often a leftist viewpoint as well. And this is becoming more important, I think, now, even when we started, especially in the beginning when we were doing straight news, we were kind of wedded to the sort of, I would say, legacy media approach of just providing facts and making sure people are informed of the basic goings on of reality. But I think the development of social media and its influence in global politics everywhere over the past few years has shown that this approach just doesn't function in the modern day. And a lot of things that especially I took for granted, a lot of things like the obvious connections in this international axis of fascism, or however you want to call it, is apparently not that clear to people. I think it's going to be one of our focuses this year, especially, to make that connection incredibly clear so that we all understand we are on the same side and our enemies are shared.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of what I mean. I think there's also a lot of room for the way information connects in people's heads is not only about raw facts. And yes, I do believe that we have leaned a bit too hard on raw fact It's so weird to say, considering that a lot of people, when they're talking about the media, they say, oh, there's been this drift from pure objective reporting. And a part of it is because that's not what people want. And like, so that is not what changes minds. That's not what really makes any kind of impact. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that our little niche podcast will have, sweeping political impacts, but I don't know. Ideas matter. And I think we should present ideas. Not that we haven't, like we've done our part through and through, but even though we've called ourselves a leftist podcast, and even though we've kind of started this as an outlet for our own ideas that we can't quite get across within legacy media, and we're both in legacy media that has its constraints, and this is our outlet to not have those constraints, we have not fully taken advantage of that. Just throwing out some topics that I would like to cover. I would really like to get into what negotiations are. I think there's a lot of just kind of empty sloganeering right now of what a peace talk is, how negotiations work, and seemingly just having people, quote unquote, sit at the table is considered a victory enough. And that's absolutely not the case. And that's also what I have a master's degree in. So I don't know, maybe I should use that master's degree to explain why what people want out of peace talks are not necessarily what's realistic for peace talks. So that's one thing that's definitely at the top of my mind to cover.
Another important topic here to tackle would be, what exactly is foreign aid? Because it is very often used as a boogeyman in Western politics. Domestic politicians love harping on the wastefulness of foreign aid to this or that cause or this or that country. And the very much flattens that kind of discourse, very much flattens what is an incredibly nuanced topic, where it doesn't just fundamentally make sense to declare foreign aid wasteful or well used or what have you. There are just so many variations. I think it would be absolutely worth to go in and explain how foreign aid functions, specifically what kind of foreign aid Ukraine gets and what kind of foreign aid Ukraine possibly can expect to continue receiving.
Yeah, I'd like to also continue some of my history stuff and kind of tie the history stuff in with wink, wink, nudge, nudge, look at it now. I kind of did that in my history podcast episode where I alluded to how the fall of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth had a lot to do with how the Polish nobility were all being bought out by Russian influence. And because they thought they were so much better than the peasants, they took whatever money they could to hold on to those privileges. And I don't know, maybe that's relevant to what we're seeing now. That's a topic that's on my mind a lot as a history nerd. And also want to do some culture stuff, look at some Ukrainian cultural products and examine them in, I don't know, a video essay type way. I don't know, something more in depth. That's where my mind is. A lot of this is just in the rough drafts phase. So don't hold me to anything I'm saying right now, even though I realize I'm broadcasting it. But that's kind of what I'm having in mind for the next year. And also, video throughout 2024, I kind of did some test video through NV. I've been editing video more. So getting a bit more comfortable with the video editing process. So maybe by mid-year, I'll have another actual video to put out through Ukraine Without Hype. It's mostly an issue of me technically knowing how to do it. I can write, I can speak, I can do everything else besides editing. That's where I need to polish before I'm comfortable putting something out. Okay, I don't know. Anything else to add on how you feel about the podcast?
No, honestly, I think we just keep doing what we're doing. And with thanks to our listeners, we know that we have an audience at all. We are not screaming that much into the void. And we started this whole thing. It was very much, we didn't expect absolutely any feedback or support or anything. I
remember how excited we got when we had 100 listens on an episode.
Yeah, it was a huge milestone, and we've come pretty far for a niche politics podcast hosted by two basically random journalists. We could do better, but we could be doing a lot worse. So I think as long as we can keep our audience, keep you guys happy and informed, then I think we will do just fine.
All right, so moving on to what happened in 2024 is our next segment here. Where the highlights, were the big news stories. And that's kind of a struggle for 2024, to be honest. The way the war played out, there were very few sweeping victories or defeats. The ones that did happen were quite marginal. It was not like 2022 where there would be massive swings in control over territory or sweeping victories and defeats that led to, huge outbursts of either, oh, we're going to win this one tomorrow or we're all screwed. 2024 was the year of attrition. And so the stories, unfortunately, from a kind of news media business perspective, were not the ones that got the interest, got the clicks. But let's go through what happened in 2024. And I think the first one to start off with was the appointment of Syrski as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, replacing Zaluzhny, who himself was a bit of a very popular, almost cultic figure in the country, like this very famed general who, according to a lot of opinion polls, is even more popular than Zelensky. Him being replaced with Syrski was met with a lot of pessimism. Though, to be honest, I think as we've seen the war went on, there wasn't a huge difference between the leadership of the two. I think a lot of people had very emotional attachment to this issue that I don't feel turned out to be warranted. I don't know. How are your feelings on how Syrski has done through the year?
No, I mostly agree that there doesn't seem to be any big difference. A lot of the reforms that Zaluzhny had attempted to make, Syrski has continued. There's been continued emphasis on expanding the role and use of drones in the armed forces. The Ukrainian government just last week announced a new something like a $68 million fund to purchase and replenish drones specifically for military units. And we've seen greater coordination and concentration in combined arms, NATO-style maneuvers with artillery, air support, well, in this case, drone support, and infantry kind of working together. And that tactic has seemingly been able to not, I wouldn't say compensate for the manpower issues that Ukraine has been having, but has ameliorated them, certainly. I feel that if these things which Zaluzhny had first tried to introduce, if they weren't paying off, we would have lost far more territory than we have already. So overall, it's hard to say that Syrski has been ineffective or he's been less effective than Zaluzhny. Though, of course, you can never prove a counterfactual. We don't live in the world where Zaluzhny had remained general. But I believe we wouldn't, had Zaluzhny remained in his post, I don't think there would have been much of a difference in terms of the military situation overall this in 2024, regardless. So about as good as one could have expected.
Yes, and a lot of the problems that we have now existed last year as well, or in the previous years as well, I should say. So I don't think it was as big of a change as people made it out to be. Though those problems are still there and do have to be fixed. We'll get into that in the next section, though. But the big thing, I think the biggest thing that happened in 2024 happened also in February. February 17th was the fall of Avdiivka. Avdiivka was probably the most important stronghold in the southern, let's work midway through Donetsk Oblast. But Avdiivka was the important stronghold. There were others as well. And it falling, everything since then has been a continuation of the post-Avdiivka offensive. They have continued this offensive. The Russians have continued this offensive throughout the year, and none of it would really have been possible if Avdiivka was able to hold out. Though its prospects for holding out were always low, it had spent a very long time in a cauldron. It had been virtually surrounded for months on end before the Russians were finally able to crack it. And I mean, just personally as well, Avdiivka was one of the last places I went in this world before the full-scale invasion started. So I do have my own kind of emotional connection to the city because of that. That is my last pre-full scale memory, basically, is Avdiivka. Going back to that mental health issue, this is a triggering topic for me. But yeah, I think the fall of Avdiivka was the beginning of a lot of very negative changes on the front lines, and it's all goes back to that. The next thing that happened, I think, is on the cultural side that I was talking about was the movie 20 Days in Mariupol won an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature Film. The film 20 Days in Mariupol tells the story of the Ukrainian journalist Sviatoslav Chernov and his colleagues who were trapped in the city of Mariupol as it was being surrounded by Russian forces, and the 20 days it took them to eventually get out. They were some of the last journalists in the city.
Then moving on to back to the war, the next kind of big headline of 2024 was on April 16th when President Volodymyr Zelensky signed a new draft law, or signed a new draft bill into law. That bill lowered the mobilization age from 27 to 25. It changed the regulatory structure surrounding conscription, which in theory would make it easier and to go through the draft process and would kind of simplify that whole thing. Based on personal experience, the new draft law has been, let's say, not implemented. It doesn't seem, at least from a layman's point of view, when I was going through this process, that anything had changed from 2018 when I went through the process before. If there was a new law in place beyond perhaps some of the adjustments to the draft admission guidelines, I can't say that much has changed despite the kind of fur made around this law. It was intended to fix our looming manpower problems and, in theory, help tackle a lot of the corruption that's present in the conscription system. Again, I can't really vouch for its effectiveness, but it did technically pass.
Yeah, this has also been one of those political things. Also, there was some attempts to cramp down on the corruption within the regional mobilization offices. That did not seem to work very well. There are continuous busts happening of various officials taking bribes, and whatever systematic approach was taken to deal with that clearly did not work. So that will have to be a real priority in the next year. And again, that's a thematic issue we'll cover in the next segment. But then in April, again, there was another big thing out of the US in that this stall on US aid that had been going on for months of Congress not approving of any additional Ukraine aid, that blockage finally passed through.
We say Congress, let's be clear. The GOP, the Republican Party, were the ones that were responsible for the holdup.
And specifically Mike Johnson. Let's name and shame. It was a problem done by Mike Johnson and done with the consent and possibly at the direct behest of Donald Trump.
Mike Johnson is, of course, the current Speaker of the House for the United States House of Representatives.
This aid blockage cost many lives. The fall of Avdiivka seemed as though it would happen eventually, but because of the ammunition starvation that Ukrainian forces had, it definitely allowed for that battle to happen the way that it did. A lot of the deterioration on the front that happened at the end of 2023 was due to this, or at least the anticipation for it, having to really budget your ammunition as much as possible, knowing what was ahead. And that momentum that the Russian gains that they were able to make because of this ammunition starvation, they're still basically running on. It still goes back to that bill. Everything goes back to momentum. Everything goes back to trends. And that trend began with that.
And again, to really stress the Republican role here, I was on a radio show this morning where I was, of course, asked how is Ukraine kind of anticipating for the Trump presidency, and what do Ukrainians think about the pronouncements and proclamations that Trump has made regarding Russia's invasion of us. And I started answering, and then I realized I had to stop, and I had to make one one thing very clear. Donald Trump is not a friend of Ukraine. He has no interest in helping us resolve this war on any sort of just, legal, or even moral basis. Again, the aid blockage was just the latest, or at the time, the latest in a string of rat fuckery that Donald Trump has done to Ukraine. If people remember what happened during his last administration when he tried to quite literally blackmail President Zelensky into making Zelensky pursue a politically motivated prosecution of Hunter Biden. So yeah, Trump's not a friend. His proclamations of that he is a peacemaker, that he will press Russia real hard to stop this dumb war. None of that's true. He is lying because he is a lying liar that lies. That is quite literally how he has lied his way into power, and he's lying now. The aid bill fuckery was just one of the many, many examples of Donald Trump fucking Ukraine.
Although if there's any silver lining to that aid block, it was that most Ukrainian politicians, the people at the top, know what they can expect in the future. They were not really prepared for the last one, but everything I'm hearing from within the administration, from commanders, from basically anyone with the capability of doing anything in Ukraine, is that they have been getting prepared for Trump calling for another halt to U.S. aid and have been taking measures to get ready for that. Stockpiling. I believe that right now things are mostly okay for at least the rest of this year as far as funding goes. So it's good to hear that they learned the lesson from this, knowing how many people had to die to teach that lesson. But moving on to May, one story is that there was an assassination attempt on Zelensky. There have been a few of those, but this is one of the more high-profile ones that led to several arrests from within the security forces. But then on May 10th was the Kharkiv offensive, which was the other big story on the front of this year, where the Russians basically re-invaded territory they had already been kicked out of. This is the battle for Vovchansk. And the lesson that we learned from that is that the Ukrainians saw the Russians build up on the border with Kharkiv region. And if Ukraine had the ability to fire missiles at them, that offensive would either not have happened or not been as effective as it was. If Ukrainians were able to fire storm shadows and other long-range weaponry at the Russian army, again, as we saw them muster together, as we saw them get ready to invade, nothing could be done to them. But that lesson did seem to be learned, because within a very short amount of time after that, there was the go-ahead from Ukraine's allies to begin using long-range weapons, specifically around that offensive. Later in the year, the broader permission to use long-range weaponry was given, but for this, because of the use of storm shadows, that offensive was able to be blunted relatively quickly. It's still very much a problem. Vovchansk is still half occupied, and what still exists is a pile of rubble. That city no longer exists because of this offensive, and because it could not be stopped ahead of time, or would not be stopped ahead of time, I should say, by our allies. But because of the introduction of these long-range weapons, it was not able to go much further than essentially 2 villages inland into Ukraine.
Though the Zelensky administration has not been particularly forgiving of the military's performance in Kharkiv Oblast, just a few days ago on January 21st, Ukraine arrested Colonel Ilya Lapin, who was in charge, who was commander of that sector of Kharkiv Oblast, the defense of it, and who the Zelensky administration is accusing and has charged with dereliction of duty and breach of oath, basically.
Yeah, there's been lots of information dug up afterwards regarding the poor state of some of the defenses in the area. That has been improved. The issue of fortifications has been improved from there, but we don't really know how much. But it raised a lot of problems. We'll see how many of them have been resolved. I'm getting into June, and we have more we had a better summer for, well, not on the front wise, but there's some positive stories from the summer. In June, the European Union formally began the accession negotiations with Ukraine and Moldova. As we talked about in the episode when this happened, EU accession negotiations are not the same thing as EU accession. Ukraine is not in the EU, and even in the best of situations, it's like a 20-year process from accession talks to joining.
And none of that will even really matter until the war is over.
But it is a good symbolic effort, at least. It is what Ukraine wanted this whole time. But just because of even without the war, it's not an immediate fix to anything. But it is Ukraine beginning the EU accession process.
Absolutely. In theory, it is a fait accompli for Ukraine to now join the European Union. However, just the other EU accession negotiations have been bungled or fumbled by other nation states. Turkey has famously had a very rocky relationship with the EU accession process, and it's not a guarantee of anything, but it does feel like a guarantee of something at least.
But also as a part of the accession process, every EU country gets to have their say on what Ukraine has to do, more or less. It has not led to much yet. There's been from sniping, of course, from Hungary. I'll get into Hungary later. But for Poland, in our November episodes, I think it was our December news episodes, we were talking about how Poland had raised the issue of basically the tragic events of World War II, mass killing of both Poles and Ukrainians by either side, and wanting to have some reconciliation for that, for having some, well, specifically they wanted to be able to go to the graves of Polish victims of that ethnic cleansing. And at first, that was treated not very healthily. I brought this up when it happened, but Poland was being very aggressive and demanding and one-sided in its demands. I brought up how this was something that had to be done, but they were doing it in a pretty rude way. Well, in the 2-3 months since that, there has been a lot more productive conversations between the Ukrainian and Polish sides on this issue. There doesn't seem to be as much hostility as there was when it was first raised. Those permissions have been granted, and it seems like that's working forward in a pretty productive manner. But also, we have July and into August, we have the Olympics, where Ukraine won 3 gold, 5 silver, and 4 bronze medals. So the Summer Olympics, Ukraine did pretty well, especially in fencing. Women's fencing is Ukraine's strongest sport.
So why we now have people like Olga Harlan as pretty much household names here in Ukraine, because these athletes had to deal with quite a bit from their Russian and Belarusian counterparts, especially. Russia, I believe, still was not allowed to compete under its national flag, but that did not stop Russians from displaying national symbols anyway, which is under the terms that they are allowed to compete under, not actually allowed. That not that Russians care. Ukrainians took note, and there have been a couple of pretty high-profile kerfluffles, I guess you would call them, between Ukrainian and Russian athletes, especially around the Olympics. Olga Harlan famously refused to shake her opponent's hand following the end of a match, and other accusations that Ukrainians are somehow unsportsmanlike when competing against the nation that is literally invading and genociding us. But there you go. That's sports. No politics allowed.
In August, we get the introduction of the F-16s. These were something that had been long promised. There were many delays. There had been lots of excuses about why the F-16s were taking so long to be delivered, even though Ukraine was talking about how absolutely vitally important these F-16 fighter jets were. In August, the first batch of them arrived from the Netherlands, where it was the first, though there have been more since then. And the F-16 has been very, very important, especially for air defense. There have been a lot of interceptions by the F-16 already. It's been proving very effective put up one F-16, is able to take down multiple Russian missiles. So that's a big boost to Ukrainian air defense. And of course, the presence of F-16s, though some have been shot down already, of course, have helped the problem of the air war on the front line. Before they arrived, there was a huge problem of the Russians being able to get close enough to the Ukrainian front lines with their aircraft to attack them directly, bombing raids, that kind of thing. That's still happening, but the F-16 does help narrow the gap there.
Kind of makes me sad that Top Gun never had a movie with the F-16. It's really been showcasing just how effective the platform is. Like Anthony said, especially with air defense, it's absolutely been proving its worth. Ukrainian commanders have been routinely praising its capabilities. And while we know very little about the F-16's deployment on offensive missions, we absolutely know that they must be occurring. And considering the Russians have been unable to parade images of burning F-16 wreckage, I think they've been relatively successful so far.
Then August 6th, we have the Kursk invasion. This is the third big military story of the three, where Ukraine was.
Yeah, I was going to say, Anthony, you said earlier that Avdiivka was the biggest kind of change in the front. I would say Kursk probably takes that title. Well, the biggest kind of military change in the front lines since we've had since the start of the full scale invasion.
Yeah, there's a compelling argument for that. It's definitely the more optimistic way to look at the front lines, certainly, where the Kursk invasion, there's been lots of speculation of why this happened, what the goals were, but it's been kind of shaken out to show that Russia had been planning multiple border incursions along the border that had that at that point not seen much direct conflict besides these small scale raids that had been occurring. It was thought that there was going to be an invasion of the Sumy Oblast in Ukraine. There had been a lot of preparing the field for that. Sumy itself was being bombed a lot, and the improvement of air defense has made that better. It's not as bad as it was, though it's not the safest city in Ukraine either. But it seemed as though there was going to be yet another incursion into Sumy Oblast by Russia, just like they had done to Kharkiv Oblast. And this invasion of Kursk meant that didn't happen. There had been a lot of buildup, kind of fake, a lot of telegraphing of a possible incursion in various parts of the northeast border, and that stopped that. Also, Kursk invasion turned into a big propaganda win, and I think the really important part of being in Kursk is showing that Ukrainians don't behave like Russians do when they occupy a territory. Ukraine invited the International Committee of the Red Cross, they invited the UN, they invited aid agencies. Not many could go because it is so heavily in conflict, but they followed all the rules that an occupying force is supposed to follow according to international law. They treated people appropriately. And who was the person actually doing abuses in the Kursk Oblast? It was still the Russian army. The Russian army took advantage of people fleeing their homes from having these kind of no man's lands to take part in the looting and destruction of their own country. And I think that was demonstrative of Ukrainian intentions.
Absolutely. And Kursk does give us more leverage for any upcoming or possible really ceasefire negotiations. Ukraine has no intention of holding on to bits of Russian territory. That's just not of interest to anyone here. And so it is something that will absolutely be traded away at some point during whatever peace negotiations eventually shake out of this whole thing. And as long as, of course, that matters only as long as we can hold it, which, despite Russia's very intense efforts, we have managed to do.
Also in August, the Ukrainian parliament voted almost unanimously, with one holdout, to ratify the Rome Statute, meaning that as of January 1st of this year, Ukraine is now a member of the International Criminal Court. We had been going through the ICC to prosecute various Russian war crimes, but did so as like a special request, basically, under the idea of universal jurisdiction, which is always kind of shaky to enforce. We talked about that the legal issues around this when it happened. You can go back and listen to some more detail on it. But it made Ukraine a much more normalized part of the international community on one hand, and it made the use of the legal system to go against Russia more valid. Though notably, Ukraine is a part of these international legal bodies, which Russia is not, and the United States is not. So Ukraine is more of the international community than either of those two. Going through to November, we have the election, but also we have the introduction of North Korean soldiers in the Kursk Oblast. This is now, it started off as rumor of, here's a photograph of North Korean soldiers making their way across Russia, and now it's fully in effect. We see mass scale use of North Korean soldiers in the Kursk Oblast. There are conflicting reports of how effective they are. Sometime I'm hearing that they are better than Russian soldiers, even if only because they're fresh. Sometimes not, the opposite, that they are less disciplined, less useful, or at least being used in less efficient ways. What is the truth? It's probably situational. I skipped right over October. Sorry. Was that there was the elections. Wonderful. In October, there was the elections in Moldova and Georgia, and the ongoing coverage of the Georgian protests. Those are still tied directly to the elections. Those are still ongoing. They're becoming more and more embedded into the Georgian society. It seems as though it's going for the long haul. I would like to speak to someone from Georgia early this year. Hopefully, we'll try to get somebody. Moldova, that basically Russia tried to overthrow the government of Moldova, and Moldova was able to hold out and hold these elections, and the pro-European side won despite just disgusting levels of interference by Russia. Right now, we'll get into this into our next news update because this story, I want to keep a lot of this to just talk about 2024. There's updates now from 2025, but there has been trouble in Transnistria, which has drug Moldova into an economic crisis, but they seem to be handling that as well. We'll cover that next episode when we talk about the news from January.
Another big election that we had in November. Well, there were a few that we will cover, but before we get to the one that our viewers are more likely to be familiar with, on November 24th, Romania held presidential elections, and those were also subject to quite a bit of Russian interference. In fact, the Russian
not settled yet. They're going to have to hold them again soon.
Yeah, the Russian interference was so bad, according to the Romanian courts, that they threw out those election results and are going to be rerunning them. Which, by the way, is a thing you can do if it turns out that your election has been severely compromised by hostile foreign interests. It is probably obligatory for your survival as a democracy to try and eliminate that interference and then hold the election again without it.
Let's call a mulligan on the whole thing. It didn't work out. Try it again. But rounding
it's not because the result was bad. It was because of
the process.
Insanely high levels of direct Russian interference in this election. There was social media interference. There was direct political sponsorship. There was skullduggery. It was a whole raft of fuckery that the Russians had tried to pull with Romania, just like they had tried to pull with Moldova, just like they're pulling with Georgia, except in this case, it did not work.
And to wrap us up with December, this was when the issue of the Russian shadow fleet really came to a head. There had been a lot of kind of murmurings about what the future problems of the shadow fleet, meaning Russia running unregistered boats in order to transport goods to different countries in order to avoid restrictions of various kinds. And in this case, it mostly had to do with oil. And in December, there was the shipwreck of one of these shadow fleet boats that poisoned the Sea of Azov, a place that had already been heavily environmentally damaged by the full-scale invasion. And that is another thing we've been covering it sporadically, but that's another topic to get into, is environmental damage, because earlier in the year, the Russians also attempted to poison the Ukrainian water supply by poisoning the Desna River that flows into the Dnipro, basically wiping out the Desna ecosystem, but thankfully did not reach the Dnipro itself, which would have been.
Anthony, I think you skipped over another big election in November.
Oh, yeah, and that'll be the last one we can say is the American elections. I don't know. Let's not get bogged down by talking about all the American elections. We've talked about that in many ways, and I just want to get...
And we're going to continue talking about them because,
I just want to get to our retrospective.
Didn't go well.
No, did not go well. Did not go very well. But our themes for this year. So moving on to that was the year in review of the actual events that happened. Let's get into the ideas that happened, the themes. And I think the one main theme that has simmered under the Ukrainian political process this whole time, and also on observing the Russian side, there's something happening on both sides, is that both have issues with manpower that have to be resolved in different ways. Ukraine, of course, mobilization is not working the way that it's supposed to, especially the issue with infantry. There is a severe lack of infantry on the Ukrainian side. I don't feel fully comfortable talking about that in depth right now because it does require a lot of research, and we've talked about it a bit in the past, but something needs to be fixed because there's not enough people in the trenches to defend the front line right now. There's parts of the military that are better staffed. There's lots of development on the drone side, of course, but you need an infantryman to hold it all together. And on the Russian side, we have seen that while they have avoided conscription and mobilization to the best of their possible abilities, the cost of a Russian soldier has increased exponentially. I saw that the signing bonus in one Russian region is $30,000. That is not the biggest chunk of money, though in Russia...
In Russia currently, that goes a long way.
That's a fortune. That is a fortune in many parts of Russia. The idea is that Russia hopes to not have to pay these benefits. And what we know is that they can't keep increasing the cost of a soldier indefinitely. They cannot. At some point, there will be a cost that the Russian state will no longer be able to pay in order to keep recruiting people. And at
least with the tactic or with the methods they're using now. But as we see, the Russians are very willing to use foreign troops as auxiliaries instead of committing their own men. Much of the conflict, or in recent months, much of the conflict in Kursk Oblast has been not with Russian troops defending their motherland, but with North Korean slave soldiers who were traded as pawns by a crazed dictator to his other friend, also a crazed dictator. So the Russians are really trying to use every method possible to avoid wide-scale mobilization. But Anthony, as you pointed out, at some point, they're not going to be able to pay people this much money to join. And once the economic incentive falls off or is minimized, I struggle to see how they're going to be able to keep up recruitment of any sort, really.
And that will come down to having to do mobilization, something. Obviously, they don't want to do it. They very desperately don't want to do it. They know the political fallout of doing that. They saw what began to be the fallout when they thought that would be the solution, and that showed the cracks in the system. But we'll see how long they can keep up this. And of course, like the foreign soldiers, we talked a lot about soldiers from India, Africa, various places around the world being offered incentives, often being lied to about what those incentives were. The other, but speaking of Africa, is the globalization of this war. We have seen the map of where Ukraine is fighting Russia expand rapidly this year. Before, there were multiple coups and overthrows of governments in especially the Sahara region of Africa, the Sahel, Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, and them being replaced, and those post-coup governments inviting in Russian mercenaries, formerly known as Wagner, now known as Africa Corps, aka the Nazi army in Africa in World War II. But Ukraine has met that challenge and has been deploying special forces units, not many at a time, maybe a couple dozen or even a dozen or less, to many of these conflicts, and especially using drone warfare, teaching people how to use drone warfare or just piloting the drones themselves. And that we saw massive amounts of Russian mercenaries wiped out in especially Mali, but it became a major part of the end of the Syrian civil war. I'm not going to say it was a decisive factor, the deployment of Ukrainian special forces, but it was definitely involved in this. So many countries, from Sudan to Mali, like I said, Syria, where Ukraine is taking the war to Russia and disrupting its interests abroad. The other thing we talked about in the summary, but long-range strikes. Ukraine is getting much better in long-range strikes. Part of this had to do with the approvals from foreign governments to use foreign-made missiles against Russia.
Be more accurate to say the lack of approval from partner nations,
which led to some of these changes. But those more recently, we've had those approvals and they had been used to great effect. But that's the less interesting part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is domestic production. The mass production of long-range drones and drones of all other kinds, but specifically in this case, these long-range drones, where basically you take a Cessna private plane, throw a bunch of explosives on it, and fly it into a Russian oil refinery. And also we saw the introduction of domestically made cruise missiles that can be used on Russian targets, that our foreign partners have no say in how they are deployed.
Now, these aren't ICBMs or even the mid-range ballistic missiles that Russia tried to threaten Ukraine with a few months back, but they are still far longer ranged than Ukraine's previous domestic weapons or forays into this area. And again, yeah, we don't need anyone's permission to use them. We don't have to call the Pentagon and say, hey, can we please use the ATACMS on this base? Or we don't have to call the French and say, hey, can we please use the Scalp on this ship? We can just do that now. And that is an amazing improvement in our long-range capabilities.
And there has been a lot of effect from this. I mean, we're now crossing into this year, but for the last 2 months, there have been so many attacks on Russian oil refineries specifically and military infrastructure. There have been drone strikes going on to Chechnya, to Kazan and Tatarstan. Places that are pretty far away from Ukraine have been seeing regular attacks by Ukrainian, usually drones, long-range drones. And that will only increase over 2025. Well, this is kind of jumping to the next section of saying our predictions. My main prediction of the next year will be we'll be seeing an exponentially larger amount of these long-range strikes, to the point of causing very severe damage to the Russian energy industry. That's what's being mainly targeted right now. Though there have been, and the other side of that is that these local Russian politicians, or how you use the word local politicians in Russia, have been having to respond to this. Because again, these are places that are far away from the front. And most people in Russia, the way they think about this war is that it's far away. It doesn't affect me. Maybe my cousin is going to get a nice military bonus that I will bug him for so he can buy me some stuff, maybe. But that's the extent to which most Russians thus far have been interacting with this war, avoiding it in most ways. And what this has done, has brought the war to a lot of people, and there have been a lot of overreactions. One of these reactions has been in Chechnya recently, where a plane flying from Baku to Chechnya, from Azerbaijan to Chechnya, was shot down by Russian air defense because they were on guard from Ukrainian drone attack. And they were jumpy, they were overly aggressive, they were not thinking rationally, and killed their own people because they were on guard from these attacks, because they just weren't prepared for the idea that they themselves could be on the receiving end of bombs.
That does remind me of that one World War II quote about the Germans foolishly entering the war with the idea that they can bomb wherever and whoever they want at any time without the same happening to them, and them being sorely mistaken by that fact.
Yeah, the thing is, the Russians, when people say the Russians are against the war, that's not true. They don't want to think about the war. The Russian government doesn't want them to think about the war. That was another thing that we saw over, especially the last 2 years. The first year of the war, there's a lot of pro-war propaganda in Russia. And since then, they've been trying to demobilize people's thoughts. They want people to not think about it. They want people to not think about any problems. Everything's fine. There is no war in Moscow. And between these long-range strikes and that potential for mobilization, how will the Russian public react? And obviously, the Russian government is leery about how the Russian public will be acting if they are told they themselves have to do something. But now getting into some diplomatic news and topics. So one thing is Hungary. I will sum this all up by saying Hungary took 2024 to be much more annoying than they ever had ever before. Hungarian autocrat Viktor Orban was unfortunately the EU president from July to December. This is not a real position, really. They are, it's a formal secretary, you can say. Like, they have the speaker of the European whatever. They can set agendas, but it's not really a power position. And it exists on a rotation where every country gets their turn. And Orban decided to take that opportunity to act like he really was the president of Europe, speaking on Europe's behalf, trying to do independent diplomacy as a European leader, trying to speak to Russia. They claimed, or they pretended to basically have organized some kind of Christmas ceasefire or something, then got very, very mad and started blaming Ukraine for being warmongers when no one respected this idea of a ceasefire because Hungary's not the other side of this war here. Russia is. Russia didn't call for the ceasefire, so why are you even trying to talk about it? And in general has been throwing up and becoming increasingly bold in how they are able to attack Ukraine from a diplomatic angle. They are no longer the EU president. It's now Poland. Donald Tusk is now in that seat, and he is a friend to Ukraine. But like I said, it's not a real position. It's just a bully pulpit, or it's not even usually a bully pulpit. He turned it into a bully pulpit. The other problems out of Central Europe, Slovakia, Fico, the head of Slovakia, tried to be a mini Orban, but he does not have the political centralization in Slovakia that Orban does in Hungary. So he could really only make noise and be annoying. And he's now facing a vote of no confidence in the Slovak parliament because he is a stupid loser who tried to distract from being a stupid loser by being mad at Ukraine and not looking out for Slovak interests. Again, with more, we'll talk about this more in our next episode of the news because it's a January thing, not 2024 thing. But the issue is that Ukraine had cut off Russian natural gas that had traversed through Ukrainian territory, leading to a Slovak energy crisis. And Fico had no response to that, even though he had his entire tenure to get ready for it. He didn't and just got mad at Ukraine. But he is facing political blowback for that. So the Central Europeans are proving problematic, including Austria. Not as much of a problem, but still a problem. And that ties into our next topic, which is the threat of far-right politicians in most countries. In France, we saw growing support for Le Pen. In Germany, we've seen growing support for Alternative for Germany. America happened. In Britain, we see the rise of the of the Reform Party. These are all forces that are hostile to Ukraine if they're able to take power. Luckily, in most of these cases, there is a bit of a cordon sanitaire against them. They are not a majority in any of these places. And as far as parliamentary politics works, if everyone else blackballs you, then even if you somehow become the biggest party, if you're not the majority party, everyone else can still get together and say, we're not having no part in that, which has held thus far. Though I'm most concerned about Britain, because I'm sure the Tories will lose a lot of their compunctions about working with the former Brexit party.
We've actually seen Reform gain in the polls, specifically in Tory constituencies, with voters that are considered to be Tory-based voters. The Reform Party really does seem to be taking the wind out of the Tory sails, which in other circumstances I might celebrate. In the current ones, Reform is even worse. So yeah, that's also not a great sign there. Nigel Farage famously is a big friend and admirer of Vladimir Putin's.
Yeah, so if the Conservatives are able to form a majority with Reform Party, that will pose a threat to Ukraine, because though the Tories have been friends of Ukraine thus far, how the United Kingdom has been one of Ukraine's staunchest allies, far-right populism could chip away at that, as it has in many other countries, namely the United States. And our last theme here is the one that, like I said, I really want to dig into early in this year, is the pressures for a ceasefire have been increasing on Ukraine. The Trump plan that has been offered up is basically to have a freeze of the front line, allow Russia to take what it has, and who knows what else. It's very unclear, and I don't even think they know what they are talking about. And this fix the war in 24 hours, whatever. I'm getting dragged back into American politics right now, which I tried consciously to avoid. But this threat of far-right populism in multiple countries could pose a larger threat to Ukraine in this coming year.
So with that said, what are some of your predictions for 2025 then?
Honestly, I have no idea. My previous prediction of going into 2024, it was that Europe would be the central focus for every planning that Ukraine would have to do. And for most of 2024, that proved to be the case. While America was blocking its supply of aid, Europe had various schemes of various effectiveness. The Czech artillery shell scheme was extraordinarily important on one hand, absolutely vital, but on the other hand, did not prove to be as effective as they were hoping for it to be. So yeah, my previous prediction, everything's about Europe. And in this case, I think everything will continue to be about Europe. And Zelensky brought this up. In one of his recent statements, he said that as everyone right now is looking to Washington in context because of the election and the inauguration of Trump, we should be looking at Europe. Europe needs to increase its military spending. It needs to take the threat of Russia much more seriously than they have. There have been improvements, like I said, over the last year, and they need to get more serious about sanctions, everything. America is a giant question mark right now. I think that at least in the short term, Ukraine aid will continue. In a lot of the massive executive actions taken by Trump in his first days, one thing that he didn't do was end Ukraine aid. There was worry that
military aid specifically.
There was a lot of concern that it would be looped into that slurry of other proclamations, but as of right now, military aid to Ukraine is still ongoing. We'll see where it goes. There are lots of ways that the Republican Party could continue aid to Ukraine for various reasons that I really don't even want to speculate on, because there is an open world of possibilities for what America could do within the next year. Europe, however, that's much more straightforward. Europe has to, even if the best case scenario happens and somehow America does not drift too far away from Atlanticism and European support and all that kind of thing, Europe still has to act like it is. Europe has to operate under the assumption that America could abandon them tomorrow at the drop of a dime. They have to be ready for that. They have to be thinking about it with every waking moment. They have to be understanding that they could have to go this alone, so that if that does happen, they'll be prepared for it and will be able to act without like chaos stopping them from being able to act. And I think in some countries that could be the case. Our partners to the immediate west, Poland, the Baltic states, I'm sure they're preparing for that already. France has an interesting position in that France has never been super comfortable with American leadership in NATO and I guess the Western Euro-Atlantic world anyway. So they have always kind of been ready to step into a leadership position, though that opportunity has never presented itself to them before. This could be it. As long as they hold off the far right and Le Pen from taking power, if forced to go into position, I think the French can. I'll say can. They have the ability to. But that's, my other predictions is, like I said before, Ukraine will itself become much more self-sufficient as far as weapons manufacturing is concerned. It was in the previous year. A lot more domestic defense production is happening in Ukraine, and that will only increase. We will see increased production of drones, increased sophistication of drones. The drones arms race has only been getting faster and faster, and what we will see a couple months from now will blow people's minds from the standpoint of a year ago. I don't know, anything else?
Well, I have my predictions are, I'll say, a lot less optimistic than yours, Anthony. I am an inveterate cynic, and as I've made it clear before, I don't believe Donald Trump has anything in store for Ukraine except rat fuckery. And to be honest, I also expect a number of new conflicts that the United States will precipitate that will again take attention and effort away from the Russian invasion, just like with Gaza. I fully expect the US government to conduct military operations in Mexico, at least, perhaps also further south of the border in Panama. And quite frankly, that will kill whatever little attention that Ukraine still has. It will make negotiations even more difficult. Now, the Russians are, however, running short of basically everything. One thing that Ukraine does have going for it is that we now have a sizable amount of NATO kit, and we have a good amount of folks that are trained to effectively use that NATO kit. And according to the sources that I've spoken to on the front lines, that kit is being used quite effectively to ensure that the Russians are not able to advance. And this is not the same as pushing forward, and it's not even the same really as successfully defending. It's just kind of slowing the rate of attrition. I expect that situation to continue, and we're going to have two kind of flashpoints or two contradictory tendencies here meet in 2025. First is a diplomatic and political win for Vladimir Putin as the United States begins to engage in whatever wild imperialist shenanigans Donald Trump has planned for that country, and as well as the weakening kind of global front against him, especially when it comes to Russia's financial status. I believe that due to Donald Trump's explicit imperialist actions that he will undertake and his kind of dismissal of international law will embolden a lot of countries to work closer with Russia despite the threat of U.S. sanctions. I think those will be pretty effectively defanged by the Trump administration in 2025, simply because he is such a transactional person and every country in the world is going to attempt to transact with him. Why bother complying with the demands of a sanctions policy when one can simply bribe the executive to ameliorate the effects of said sanctions policy? And I expect to see that a lot. However, again, Russia is coming to a flashpoint, a cliff with the amount of men that they have. They're going to have to sooner or later risk rather large political unrest, perhaps not, but The expectation is rather widespread political unrest if they do ramp up to full mobilization. And there is not, North Korea doesn't have enough old Soviet stuff to give to Russia to let them maintain any kind of pace of advance. Ukrainians have gotten incredibly good with short-range precision strikes. Our drone operators, I will say without hesitation, are the best in the world. There is no other country in the world that can use drones as effectively in military operations as Ukraine, and that expertise is continuing to improve. So these two tendencies are going to result in a major change. It's hard for me to say exactly what that change will be because so much of this is dependent on how aggressive Donald Trump is feeling. But these things will come to a head in 2025. We will see a major shift on the battlefield one way or the other, and I don't think it's going to go all that positively for Russia, despite all the advantages that they're currently carrying. Now, I do also expect that Ukraine will functionally cease receiving aid from the United States. While military aid has, quote unquote, not been affected, what that means is that there are some long-running contracts for shell supply, for ammunition restock, for air defense systems, and so on that are ongoing. Those contracts are not set to expire anytime soon. However, that does not mean that the Trump administration is going to send Ukraine new aid, and it is still unclear whether the Trump administration's 90-day freeze of foreign aid applies to the financial aid that Ukraine receives, which is a major part of the Ukrainian economy. One of the ways that the National Bank of Ukraine has managed to keep the Ukrainian economy afloat, even in these rather trying times, is by propping up the value of the hryvnia by buying dollars pretty much willy-nilly. A lot of this is using the money allocated to us by the United States to go back to the US Treasury and say, hey, great, give us a bunch of dollars now. And while this has allowed the hryvnia to kind of stay stable-ish within the 40-ish hryvnia to $1 range, Ukrainian economists believe that without this buying program, without the stabilization program from the NBU, the hryvnia will likely shoot up to 50 or even 60 or higher. That is, the Ukrainian economy is in shambles, and it is being artificially propped up by partner funds, pretty much. Without those funds, and the US, by the way, is the biggest contributor to Ukraine's financial stability than any other country.
Individual country.
Individual contributor. Yes. That's not to say that the other countries don't donate or they don't contribute significantly to the operation of the Ukrainian government. They do, but individually, the United States is the biggest contributor. When and if that money will dry up, well, my prediction is that it will dry up. It is very difficult to say how Ukrainian citizens would react. One of the reasons Ukrainians have been dubbed so, quote unquote, resilient by the Western media and by Western observers in regards to this war is because the Zelensky administration has invested a lot of time, money, and effort into maintaining semblance of normal life in the rear, behind the front lines, in the vast swaths of the country that are not occupied and are fully under the control of the Ukrainian government. The Zelensky administration has tried to continue infrastructure projects. It's continued social work. It's tried to expand various benefits programs and so on while cutting others. But all of this has been aimed at making sure that Ukrainians don't flee the country, because already Ukraine has lost, I forget what the exact number is, but a significant portion of our population with the start of the full-scale invasion. If the economic situation worsens, that will worsen. Our manpower issues will worsen. Our tax base will worsen. All of this feeds into each other. So the Zelensky administration has deemed it pretty much vital to make sure that normal life will continue despite the worsening or sometimes improving situations on the front. But when US aid is cut off, I don't expect Europe to be able to match that, at least not initially. And again, so many of the international financial organizations also receive the majority of their funding from the US. It's going to be very difficult for the Zelensky administration to keep that under control. And on top of that, I predict we will be forced to at least sit down at the table. There will not be an end to the war in 2025. I guess that's my ultimate prediction. This war will not end this year. We'll be forced to sit down, but there will be a major change on the front lines. There are going to be major changes geopolitically, and there are some pretty worrying challenges and obstacles ahead for Ukraine and her people.
Yeah, I don't predict that there would be, a formal, peace summit at Camp David or anything like that. But I do think that the pressure will be on to have at least indirect diplomacy, even if that indirect diplomacy doesn't get anywhere. Put a Russian and Ukrainian delegation into the same hotel and have someone running back and forth. Things that we saw at the beginning of the war, such as in Turkey. There will be pressure to do that again, even though I don't see anything productive happening because of it. It'll then just become Ukraine's responsibility to look like the more responsible party in that game and make sure that the Russians look like the ones that are being stupid and demanding. Anyway, so we'll wrap this up with a little bit of good news. So that ends episode 100. The new year going into 2025 episode. We had a little bit of good, a lot of bad, which I think sums up what's going to happen in the next year. Romeo, thank you for being with us for 100 episodes and to 100 more.
Same to you, my friend.
Listeners, thank you very much for being with us on this journey. It is not yet over. It's never over.
Oh, we'll be here as long as we can. As long as we've got internet and microphones, which is ideally forever, we will be here bringing you the latest happenings from Ukraine and the region.
If you would like to support Ukraine more broadly, as always, go down to our link tree. I'll probably update that in the near future. I think that's getting long in the tooth. If you'd like to support Ukraine Without Hype, please tell your friends and family about us. We'll be, like I said, putting out a bit more variety in our output, so maybe some things that people weren't interested in the past, they will be interested in the future. If you'd like to support us financially, you can go to patreon.com/Ukraine Without Hype. Your donations keep the lights on, sometimes literally so. And I would just like to thank all of our Patreon subscribers. You're the real ones. You've been with us this whole way. We've always been loving your input. We'll maybe do another question and answer session after a bit of the topic backlog is set aside that can go to the end of the line to tell you what you want to know about. And we definitely want your input. We have our Discord, which any of our subscribers have access to ask us questions, give us ideas, get announcements. So thank you very much to Deborah Grazer, Randy McNerlin. The voices in my head are from Big Pharma, David Shepard, Giorgio, Ivanka Kratskaya, Michael Drucker, Mike, Anonymous, Barbara, Dennis Napalm, Devi, Dimitri, Elizabeth Hughes, James Berg, Jan, Yanara, Jenny Louise, Kevin Alberton, Kyle Smith, Marguerite, Megan, Michael Wickman, PLM, Silas Frank, T. Bart, Vivek, Abel, Ada McDonald, Alex Grochmal, Anastasia, Andrew Glenn, Kin Dystopian Fiction, Please Remain Fiction, Captain Technical, Chris Bennington, Christopher Yee, Daniel Spring, Dan, David Wall, Demetrio, Dish Taco, Emily Bavona, Evelyn, Francois, Grace Krause, Had to Laugh, Jacob Holm, James Wise, Jared Bradley, Jerd, Julia Lindsay, Justin R., Kimberly Whaley, Kyle Johnson, Laura De Leon, Laurie Halila, Lemonikin, Levy Grove, Marianne, Matt Miller, Melissa Kaselko, Anonymous, Noah Brown, Noam Hart, RDK, Sanjay, Scott Burry, Scott Gengris, Scott Tokayuk, Stuart Akers, Settled Knife, Ursula Zolenkoff, Veronica, William Brown, Zay Perry, and Marcus Nashkis. Thank you all very much for your support. So, until next episode, Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!